Castaway's Banner, written by Silas Jackson and Abigail Drake, read by Devra Mattes. Act 1. The Godless Paladin. Chapter 1. Caven jerked awake and instinctively grasped for the spear beside him, fingers closing on the wooden shaft as if the weapon was a talisman. Steam curled from his sweaty brow into the dry, frigid air. He sat upright and clutched the solid rock beneath him while his heart gradually stopped thudding, grounding himself with the biting sensation of cold under his gloved fingertips. As his breathing fell back under his control, he raised his gaze and took in the sweep of the ravine wall opposite. His gaze moved gradually upward, climbing towards the rim. There, the stenciled silhouettes of raised spears and bayoneted rifles bristled starkly against a yellowing sky, which did not yet show any stars. But the larger of the moons was becoming visible, waxing full. Night is close. The slight scrape of a whetstone gliding precisely along honed steel drew Caven's gaze. To his left, Lestara sat on a rock, knees wide and hunched over, the butt of her axe haft on the stony ground between her feet. She slowly, methodically moved a small whetstone along the blade of the axe. Caven met her eye and they exchanged nods, Lestara acknowledging he was conscious and not asking about his violent jolt awake. His nightmare was intimately familiar already. It was always the same, and there was no reason to question it now. "It will be time soon," Lestara said, glancing at Caven. Caven grunted. He paused to wipe the sweat from his brow with the back of his glove, droplets already forming into ice crystals as the air moved across them. "Good. I'd rather roast on live coals than freeze here." Lestara shrugged. "You may yet get that chance." "We all may." She continued sharpening her axe as the sky darkened. Caven reached for his mask. When Caven's unit had first entered the ravine during the previous night, they all knew they were taking a risk, attempting to move unseen by the mass of enemies in the meadow beyond and get into position to flank them in their camp after the intervening short day as the next long night descended. Their enemies outnumbered and outgunned them, or else the crafty, stealthy tactics wouldn't have been necessary in the first place. They were driven by desperation. The main battalion had been trapped so long, cut off from supply lines. A quick death while trying something brazen and potentially heroic seemed palatable. They all knew if the enemy discovered their gambit and wheeled about in sufficient numbers to trap the detachment in the ravine, there would be no need for a fight. The enemy, with their better-ranged weaponry, could simply hold their superior position and pin the weaker force below, preventing their escape from either end of the ravine. Unsurprisingly to Caven, that, the worst possible scenario, was exactly what happened. A small contingent of the enemy mercenaries had spotted Caven's unit making their move and called for reinforcements at the high windswept rim of the ravine. Those lookouts had, Caven had reflected since, probably been placed on watch there, anticipating just such a flanking maneuver. The sun rose upon Caven and his allies in a hopeless situation. Despite the sun-drenched hours since then, not a single shot had been fired yet in the long, bitter standoff. The enemy force was too disciplined, and ammunition was not to be wasted. Caven's foes knew they had no need to do anything but wait. The trapped warriors and horses below could not advance or retreat, nor were they provisioned to hunker down and stay where they were. They would surrender, or they would freeze to death when night came again. There was no third option available to them. When the bleak winter twilight finally failed, true darkness at first reached Caven like a trickle of air to someone on the brink of asphyxiation. As the black velvet of night settled fully upon them, Caven felt himself able to breathe freely again. With a minimum of words exchanged, he and Lestara broke off from the unit as planned. While crude torches, as well as the few old-world lights the unit had in their possession, were lit to rivet enemy attention and screen the pair's departure from roving eyes, Caven and Lestara moved in darkness down the canyon. Swift and quiet, they kept to the shadowy walls, the firmament above blocked from view by beetling rocks, lest the crisp starlight betray them. They paused briefly at every patch of deeper darkness in the textured rock, hoping against hope to find a grotto worn by whatever ancient waterway had made this ravine. As they leaned into each aperture, though, they were freshly disappointed to realize it was merely a shadow crevice and not a cave mouth. Arriving at a spot where the tight canyon opened out somewhat and the vertical walls transitioned to steep scree ascending towards dark looming trees above, they paused to collect themselves and consider their options. Lestara wobbled on her feet. Caven reached out to grab her upper arm and steady her. Neither of them spoke. She was weak with hunger, as was the whole unit pinned in place behind them, waiting to die if they failed in their desperate search for some quirk of terrain which would let them all escape from the enemy unwatched and unstopped. So there was a task to be finished before they had liberty to consider what condition the ordeal had left them in. Caven cleared his parched throat. Whether the floor of the canyon has ascended or the top of the ravine has lowered, the climb here doesn't look to be as lofty or hazardous as elsewhere. Lestara nodded in the dark, which is why the enemy would simply spring the trap if the unit started traveling this way. But perhaps if we climb it now, we will have a better view around for other, less obvious ways out of the ravine. Caven and Lestara scrambled as quietly as they could up the slope. They moved cautiously and avoided loose rocks so it wouldn't clatter noisily down the incline. Caven feeling ahead with the iron-shod butt of his spear before committing their weight to anything. They knew they were separated from the main enemy Overwatch by at least a mile, but they also knew their foes were disciplined and strategic in their countermeasures, and thus there was every reason to be careful. They reached the top of the steep scree and stepped onto brittle, frozen forest understory. Hoary leaves popped and crackled, cloaked by the whisper of bare, twiggy branches creaking in the breeze overhead. Lestara turned and looked back from the height they had just climbed, scanning the starlit ravine for offshoots or areas where vegetation could offer even marginal cover, or anything else to help hide a retreating force's movements and give them any advantage if forced to escape under fire. Like the trees, though, the sparse stands of bushes were skeletal. Nothing about the wending ravine offered shelter from eyes on the rim above. "Damn it," Lestara snapped, hands balling into fists. "All we've done is confirm how badly we have been outmaneuvered. I don't see how we can survive this." She turned to Caven, waiting for him to speak, eyes searching him. If anyone could turn the tide in this desperate situation, it would be the famously unkillable Slayer. She craned her neck to look into his face ahead above her, though the attempt was useless. Behind the goggles of his mask, white in reflected starlight, whatever Caven was thinking or feeling could not be discerned. "We should continue a bit farther through the woods, parallel to the ravine," he said finally, motioning with his gloved hand towards the dark trees. "We might see something." He dropped his arm, the mismatched pelts drooping back into place on his huge shoulder. Lestara nodded somberly, her face showing that Caven's words were as good as a death knell to them all. What he had wasn't a plan for victory. It was a delay in accepting defeat. Nonetheless, they pushed on, hungry, thirsty, hopeless, sustained by grim resolve and nothing else. Caven and Lestara stepped from the encircling trees into a small clearing, brushing past branches. A powder of snow fell from the disturbed evergreen boughs, silvery in starlight. Overhead, a riot of stars blinked yellow, red, and white in a great streak across the firmament. In the center of the clearing, a monolithic pillar stood, crystal-like in shape, its sides smooth and bland, its top tapered to a spike. The pillar's gossamer shadow fell across the frozen ground, a mellow glow from the sky above glinting against the unscratchable metal of its surfaces. Lestara huffed, "We're getting too far afield from the ravine now, and have found nothing to help us." Caven bowed his head, eyes fixed on the ground as he considered what to do. The pillar, no different from countless others which rose from these lands, was practically transparent to him, blending into the background, irrelevant to his thoughts. Lestara was correct. They had found nothing useful. Their efforts scouting had come to nothing. "We've failed," Caven finally said. "We can only go back and—" The crisp snap of a branch made Caven flinch and whirl around to face the lowering tree line near where they had entered the clearing. Headlights flared to life, making Lestara squint, throwing her stenciled outline against the pillar behind. The dull roar of a buggy's motor coming online signaled skirmishers to close on the clearing from all sides. Caven could only clutch a spear and grit his teeth as he watched the warband tramp out of the frozen bushes, faces calm, like hunters wary of their trapped prey, but confident it would soon be dead. 4 of the 6 enemies carried magnetic rifles and crooked arms, barrels trained on Caven and Lestara. Through Caven's goggles, though the rest of the benighted woodland was shown to him in black and white, he saw the rifles outlined in bloody red, a warning of the deadly weapons his enemies carried, which he could now do nothing about. Lestara braced herself to stand her ground, eyes fixed on the closest of the advancing skirmishers. Caven stood rooted at her side, head pivoting, gaze moving around the clearing. 6 of them. Not only are we outnumbered, they have better weapons than we have as well. And even if we get away, they have that buggy to chase us down. This was probably a patrol group moving along the rim of the ravine in case anyone tried to climb out, and we obliged. Caven growled softly, involuntarily. "Don't shoot them yet," one of the skirmishers said, probably the leader of the patrol because the rest obeyed. He turned towards Caven and Lestara, gaze moving between them, as if unsure which one to address. "It will be less trouble for everyone if we negotiate the surrender of your division back in the ravine. Maybe a few of you will survive that way. If you don't surrender, you will all die." Lestara joined Caven in soft growling. "What conditions do you offer?" she said after a pause. The patrol leader chuckled, eyes fixing on her. "Do you think you're in any position to ask that?" "Why should we—" Lestara started before a sudden, cataclysmic sound scrubbed her words away. The trees around the clearing groaned as they listed inward, drawn by a drop in pressure which made Caven's ears pop painfully and snatched the breath from his chest. A roaring, rolling crackle tore through the night, like the echo of thunder across a range of mountains. The darkness flared with blue-green light, blended with bands of yellow and pink, as if the air all around had become radiant, washing the clearing with a starburst that had no other source than itself. The inhalation gave way to a cyclopean exhalation. The trees redoubled their groaning, bent away from the clearing as if by a shearing wind, forcing them to the edge of their breaking point as a splintering boom shook the frozen ground. The buggy was turned aside by the rush, the skewed headlight beams cut out. Caven moved with the impact of air against his back, taking a few shuffling steps, then dropped to his knees, nearly blinded as his goggles died and the natural night enfolded him. The radiance of the air fell away, like the brief light of a firefly decaying peacefully back to darkness. Caven's enhanced sight returned as the tactical overlay in his goggles rebooted. Wavering at first, the clearing around him sharpened and became steady, static dissipating while he watched the stunned skirmishers getting to their feet. They blinked at each other and at him, jaws slack. Caven's breath caught. He focused on the magnetic rifle hanging by a strap on the shoulders of a nearby skirmisher. He knew his mask had rebooted and was working, but the red outline was gone. He glanced at the buggy. The headlights were still out. The motor had ceased to purr. Caven gripped Lestara by the shoulder, pulling her from her knees as he rose himself. "Their weapons are dead. We have the edge. Now." Betting her life that Caven was correct, Lestara moved beside him, leaping into the fray and catching the stunned skirmishers before they could mentally recalibrate to the reversal which had just occurred. Caven's spear dominated the space, stabbing and parrying with reach the scrambling skirmishers could not begin to match using the bladed sidearms they attempted to draw, after they had wasted a crucial moment ineffectually squeezing triggers, realizing too late their rifles would not fire. A frantic, one-sided melee followed to prove the adage. The winner of any new fight is whoever first realizes the old fight has changed. Lestara, experienced in fighting alongside Caven, easily ducked below his twirls and spins, moving away from him to give his long weapon a wide berth. She unslung the shield from her shoulder, holding it in front of herself and wielding her axe with the other arm. Beating the dazed skirmishers back, she drove in the opposite direction from Caven. They soon took the whole tract of open ground. 5 of the 6 skirmishers littered the frozen rocks and dirt within seconds. The last, too panicked to think through what was happening, leaped for the disabled buggy and tried to start the motor. The motor did nothing. Caven turned towards the buggy, the hulking silhouette of his head and shoulders rising above the windscreen of the simple vehicle, goggles white with starlight glare, muffled breath rasping through his mask. The skirmisher tried again to wrench the ignition, groaning in despair as the reticent motor still did not respond. Caven moved in a blur, hurling a spear. The windscreen shattered. The skirmisher slouched in his seat, the shaft of the spear protruding from his chest. Silence descended on the clearing. Caven caught his breath, turning to glance at Lestara. They exchanged shaken looks across the clearing, both of them dirty and haggard, increasingly weak as the terror and fury faded. Caven cleared his throat. What just happened? Lestara's gaze fell to the ground. She pulled herself taller, neck going stiff. Caven. Caven took a moment to retrieve his spear, then moved towards Lestara tentatively, baffled by the new alarm he heard in her voice. Now what is it? She did not reply out loud. Raising her face to give Caven a meaningful look, she stepped aside to clear his view to the pillar. Caven flinched, seeing what Lestara had seen. A naked human shape lay on a patch of ground at the base of the pillar, the snow blasted clear and raw dirt exposed. She was curled on her side, knees drawn to her chest, hugging her shins with both arms. In the sharp black and white of Caven's vision, he saw every detail of her placid face. Eyes closed, lips parted slightly, breathing evenly. Her hair was done in tight box braids, hanging to her curved jawline, her scalp exposed in even rows where the tresses were drawn away. Her slim neck was relaxed, head lolling freely to the frozen soil. Caven turned his gaze to Lestara. Where did she come from? I don't know, but she's going to freeze like that, Lestara said. Help me! Moving quickly to grab fur pelts from the downed skirmishers, they hastily bundled the unconscious girl and stepped back, staring at her in confusion and awe. As they watched the girl sleep, Caven considered what had happened in the previous half-minute. The clearing filled with inexplicable light. Technology was disabled by a pulse of energy. My mask, with its off-world origin, was the quickest to restart itself in the aftermath, but even that was briefly scrambled. Where did that pulse of energy come from? He raised his gaze to the pillar above the swallowed girl. It seemed to be inert now, the smooth, gray-black sides as featureless as they had ever been. But seeing the pattern of the blown-out snow, it was plain to judge the pillar had been the epicenter of whatever had occurred. Look, Caven said, drawing Lestara's attention to what he had inferred from the snow. Lestara scrunched her brow. What? Did this girl activate the pillar in some way? Caven stared at Lestara, then at the sleeping girl, mind racing behind his mask, his perplexed expression hidden. If she did, was the intent to help us? Whoever she is, she's on our side? The girl grumbled softly, shifting in her swaddling furs. Caven and Lestara winced, seeing movement beneath the furs as she began to drowsily loosen her hold on her shins and unfold her body. The girl's eyes fluttered open and turned towards the looming, baffled, dirtied warfighters, focusing slowly while she lifted her head from the softness of the furs and blinked away the pall of deep sleep. "Hello," she said, voice timid and soft. Too many unarticulated questions to count, folded into the single word.